Hey everybody, welcome to the True Balance Transformation Center. Good to have you here. I want to show you a few things that we talk a lot more about in some of our yoga workshops about how to understand your body working very safely in the yoga poses, how to recognize when there's trouble, and without the skin and muscle and everything else, to really understand what your bones and joints are doing in a yoga pose. And again, all of this comes down to learning how to make sure you're doing the poses safely. So the first thing I want to talk about is the back leg in some of the lateral poses like Virabhadrasana, Warrior Two, Triangle Pose, and various poses like that. The first thing to be paying attention to is the hip socket here. So we have the pelvic wing, the innominate bone, and then we have the femur and the head of the femur. And we call it a ball and socket joint. And if this is the back leg in Warrior Two, you can see that the wider my stance is, the more clearance I'm going to have for that femur bone to not bang up against the upper lip of the innominate bone here. One of the ways that we actually can help avoid that is by that turn, the instruction you may have heard where you turn the foot in slightly of the back leg. And that helps to adjust the head of the femur for more clearance there. So one thing you want to be mindful of, if you've got a very wide Warrior Two stance, or even triangle pose in the beginning of that pose, or wide legs, say in Prasarita Padottanasana, wide leg forward bend, you want to be mindful that there's no sense of pinching at the top of your thigh bone there. And as you go deep into the warrior pose, you want to feel that there should be some play still here. In other words, you should be able to tilt your pelvis a little back and forth. If you cannot tilt your pelvis, in this case towards what would be the right leg, it means you're probably right up against the end range of your joint here, and you may be squishing some structures that do not want to be squished. And that can lead to hip trouble, arthritis, or even worse trouble over time. So that's one thing to be paying attention to. The second thing that we'll be looking for, let me get this hand out of the way, is the forward leg, the leading leg. Here, what is often heard, and I've talked about this a little bit in other videos, the position of the pelvis. And you're often heard to square the pelvis towards front. Well, if we do that, let me get that hip in the socket. If we do that, we're causing a major opening to the inside of that left femur joint. Now, a lot of people do not have wide ranges of motion there. Very few people can get the pelvis square in the way that the skeleton is doing right now. So if you feel a lot of pulling here in the beginning of your yoga practice when you're just starting out, like as a beginner practitioner, maybe a little sensation there is okay as these muscles and tissues are starting to elongate. But if you're a regular practitioner and you constantly feel pulling here at the inside of the leading leg in, say, Warrior Two, Triangle Pose, half moon pose, you may actually be over pulling the ligaments and structures there. So be very mindful of that. And in the way I talked about in the back leg, there should be some play. So if you find as you try to square your pelvis towards front, and this knee here, this left knee in this case, starts to follow it in, collapse in other words, and it'll cause the foot to collapse too, then what's happening is you are at end range at that hip. And once again, structures can be injured over time. I want you to be paying attention to that. One way that you can start to help that is being mindful of where this knee, and I'm sorry this knee is pointing the wrong way as I'm demonstrating this, to be mindful that your knee joint of the leading leg is pointing straight out over the toes. So if that's our leading leg in triangle pose, very commonly, because of restriction here, we see that knee joint pointing across the room diagonally. And that tells me that you may be in trouble here. So we always work on getting that knee bone to point straight out over the toes. One way that you can help do that, if you're restricted here and you're trying, you can't get that knee to turn out, is to actually unsquare the pelvis by turning here a little bit towards that leading leg. That may be your particular need in that pose. That said though, the give and take is that puts more potential for impingement on the back. So what comes out of all of this is some humbleness for where your body structure is, and this literally is structure we're talking about, bone. You're not going to outstretch bone. It's impossible, of course. So you may have to have a higher pose rather than the deep, deep poses you see with Iyengar and everybody else who's got just structures that can go everywhere. You may have to lift out of the pose such that your front leg is not parallel to the ground. You may have to turn a little bit to allow for freedom in your leading hip. All of these things are stuff that we have to discover over time. And just to take a little bit of a deeper dive with this, the discoveries we make with the physicality helps us build the muscle to be able to discover the things for, say, the mental and emotional parts of ourselves that we can then learn to adjust. We can learn our mental and emotional structures too, and see where we need to make some tweaks in our own life. That's the beauty of a yoga practice. Again, stuff that we talk a lot more about in our yoga workshops. Take a look at this. I'd love to hear your feedback. And thanks for coming in. We'll see you next time.